counterintuitive to who you think you know yourself to be. And one of the reasons that I'm giving a series of talks is because sometimes when I'm working with people in counseling, I'll say to them, you know, the thing that made you who you are is the result of and this might be shocking to some of you, over 2 million relationships had to happen for you to get here. 2 million relationships had to happen for you to get here. So don't think for any stretch of the imagination that every one of those relationships didn't have an influence on who you are today. Now, I know for some people who are sort of stuck in an empirical sense, like they can't imagine why they should feel any different, or they can't imagine why they feel the way they do, is because there's this huge amount of experience that is constantly pressing against our behavior, our emotions, the tendency to how we react to things. And I'll give you an example. If I was to stretch a piece of butcher block paper there, just on like a big band all the way over here, and I said that represented the continuity of existence. And what I would say is that most people, they don't recognize that continuity, because most people take like little frames and they frame portions of that experience of their lives, and they put all their focus in that one portion of that experience. And what happens is you get so pulled in and sucked in to all the things that you should have been, should have done, should have, could have, would have stuff. And it just keeps wearing on you, and it keeps feeding itself, and you begin to think that's who you are. And typically, it's when people not only think they made a mistake, the worst thing is they think they are the mistake. And you know, when you're dealing with somebody like that, you really have to be compassionate and keep reminding them that's not who you really are. You're quite a bit more uniquely wonderful than that. But a lot of people tend to frame their lives, and these frames become their personal history. Now, the thing I like about my research, when I'm reading back into different philosophers, one of my favorites is Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, there is no history, there's only biography. Biography. Which means that the whole thing is who you are. The whole enchilada, the whole thing is pushing itself into you, and to frame just a piece of it and say that's who I am would be a complete and utterly ridiculous mistake to make, because it would automatically limit you to thinking that's who you are. So sometimes when I'm working with people, I tell them, you know, you're not only so much more, you have the potential, the creative potential to really emerge in this life and be something quite remarkably different than you see yourself currently. And a lot of people have a hard time believing that, because they've been stuck in that little frame for so long that the idea of that seems ridiculous. Now we add to that another piece of information. There's a lot of theologians that only go back, like say, 8,000 to 9,000 years when they're studying God. But the truth is, Homo sapien, modern Homo sapien, has been on the planet at least 60 to maybe to 150,000 years. So why would you only study 8,000 years of history and not study at all? And a lot of people would say, well, because there's no written record of it. That's true. Writing wasn't invented until about 3,500 years ago. Agriculture came in about 10,000 years ago. Does that mean that we completely throw out the entire experience of 70,000 years? Do we simply say to ourselves, that didn't count? Or do we typically marginalize it or minimalize it by pretending that these were Stone Age people? They weren't sophisticated. How do you know that? How do you know? Because they had the same basic modern mind that we do. They had the same capacity. They just didn't have skill sets evolved, but they were developing those skill sets. But that doesn't mean they weren't feeling something. It doesn't mean they weren't having an interaction with life. So here's a piece of information that kind of shocked me when I first discovered it. You know those wonderful cave drawings in France and Spain that are rumored to be between 30 to 50,000 years old? All those dimensional paintings against the walls, they're all about hunting. They're all about animals. They're all about depicting nature. There's nothing in there that depicts any kind of a religious or spiritual concept. Yet, in the same area that those were popular in France and Spain, and also around the Mediterranean into Turkey, modern-day Turkey, they found over 7,000 small feminine figurines that were dimensionally carved and represented what initially male anthropologists said was a fertility doll. See, the assumption is that you're dealing with a fertility doll, so therefore it must be all about, so they just put it in their pocket like some sort of modern pornography and walk around it. How utterly absurd. But yet, by dismissing it, they miss so much of what it has to offer. So we rely upon Marjorie Gimbatas, who's a wonderful anthropologist at UCLA, and Leanne Eisler, who's a fabulous anthropologist, to give us some insight into these little figurines. And they weren't all the same, but they had the basic shape of a woman. No arms, no legs, usually no face and a head. They had a head on it, but it was notched in many cases. Now, what was the notches? They feel, and they have pretty good evidence, that the notches represented the phases of the moon. The phases of the moon mystery. And the moon was the first significant observation that the Paleolithic and Neolithic folks were making in understanding cycles and patterns. Our modern day moon is the Wall Street Journal. That's what we tend to look at. We don't tend to look at nature, we tend to look at the intellect. These people were looking at the moon as helping them understand how cycles come and go. Now the phenomenal thing is that they recognize that in the cycle of the moon, there's this waxing of the moon where it grows and goes inside, and then there's this waning of the moon, and then guess what? The moon disappears. For 3 days, the moon disappears in the cycle. And out of that disappearance and the regeneration of the moon again, complete fulfillment of it, and the regeneration going out, and then disappearing and coming back, came the whole concept of life and death regenerating itself. Now, in the book, The Mythical Goddess, which Anne Barry and Jules Cashwick wrote, I gave you a little bit of extra reading material if you want it. And I'm just going to read you a little bit of what Anne Barry says in her book. She says, for Paleolithic people, whatever they observed was defined by a seasonal rhythm. If they looked to the sky, they saw the migrating and returning birds, among them the crane, the goose, the hare, and the swan. They saw the salmon leaping upstream in the great rivers at a definite time of the year. They saw the sequence of budding, blossoming, and fruiting of the many different kinds of trees, and the fall of the leaf. And they saw the gestation and birth and growth and death of all the kinds of animals in a predictable rhythm. It was as if all was expressing itself in some sort of specific analogy that was enabling them to see things. It must have been this power to think analogically that enabled them to perceive a relationship between a heavenly order symbolized by the moon and an earthly order they saw around them. Now the reason I'm bringing that up is because most people have no concept of where this thing called God came from. It came from those kinds of observations. And you're still making observations today. Excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of agua. And they're still making observations today. But a lot of the observations we make go unnoticed in our conscious life. Because we're automatically actually experiencing the only real sin in this world, and there's nothing original about it whatsoever. The only real sin is comparison. I'll say that again. The only real sin is comparison. It's where you start comparing your life to another life, thinking that that's who you are, failing to see the big picture because you're so framed in limited thoughts and ideas of who you are, who you really are. Now the reason that's so important is because my job is to get you out of the contextual frame of limitation. Any anger, any resentment, any sense of loss of limitation, any sense of minimalizing or marginalizing or even exaggerating, all exist in frames. And they become historical. And we forget who you are biographically. And worse yet, you disguise yourself in your history. It's like you're walking around in your history. And that history becomes how we know you. Limited, uncaring, indifferent perhaps. Maybe inspired occasionally, but definitely not consistent. So the whole concept here is to get more consistent with the life you've been given to live in such a way where it begins to emerge out of you this amazing experience of this phenomenal, infinite potential that you possess. But how would you know you possess it if you've never seen it? The famous analyst Jung, who lived in the mid-19th century, said that everything that you look on the outside is a dream. It's only when you look inside that you awake. Only when you look inside do you wake up. When you look outside, you're dreaming. Now, is it possible that you've been dreaming your whole life and you have taken no time to look within to who you really are? I'm going to give you an example. About 18, 19 years ago, I was reading the LA Times, and I was studying, I was a minister, I do a lot of reading about philosophy and theology, etc., etc. And I was reading this article about this display of goddess traditions in Westwood, at the Women's Center there in Westwood. And so I went I decided to go there, I found out where it's at. It's on Robertson's Boulevard. I'm looking for it, and it's actually a house. It's not even an official building. And it was very hard to find. And it's like things that are really worthwhile are sometimes hard to find. So I'm driving around, I see it, and there's no place to park. So you gotta park on the streets and walk to it. So it's not easy to get to, like many things that are worthwhile in knowing, not easy to get to it, but keep going. So I get there and I'm standing in line. There's about 15 people waiting in line to get in. And I realized, I'm a guy. This is a women's center. What if they don't let me in? What? Do you think that's possible? So I'm really getting kind of worked up and worried for nothing. Because I immediately paid my $5, whatever it was. I walked right in. And I started walking around, looking at these different goddess altars. Now, for instance, did you know that in the 3rd, 4th century, there was a huge rise of different small groups of women who were worshiping Mary as the primary focus of Christianity. A lot of people don't know that. And then around 397, when the New Testament was finally canonized and organized, the Pope decided that he was going to knock off all of this Mary worship stuff, and he was going to focus on Jesus, and so the whole Mary thing was disbanded. But it didn't really disband, no. Because like anything else that's worthwhile observing, it sometimes go underground. And where did it rise up? In China, of all places, back in the 5th century. How did that happen? How does anything happen like that? Where suddenly this whole idea, the concept of understanding the feminine form of the nature of God would now rise up in a different place. And the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is because there's a tendency, a strong tendency, to be dominated by a male concept of God. Tendencies to think it's God the Father. I'm going to talk about that in about 4 weeks. Next week we're going to talk about the great above and the great below. But this week it's all about death, life, and regeneration, and what is going on inside of us. So I'm at this goddess festival that's showing different various altars to various goddess traditions, and I'm having this pivotal shift inside of me. Pivotal, emotional. And I get to the one display where there was this one group of goddesses that baked bread on a regular basis. Have you ever smelled freshly baked bread? Isn't it like one of the most enchanting smells on the whole planet? At least it is to me. So I did not want to leave. I just like this constant smell of this beautiful baked bread. So I'm walking out of this women's center, and I'm driving down Robertson's Boulevard, and I see a woman of Hispanic nature carrying these bags, and I'm thinking to myself, that's a human being. That's a human being who deserves 100% of my respect and my love and my peace. And I had this instant inclination that says, never again will I ever make that unavailable. That's available to anybody, irrespective of what station in life you may hold, irrespective of your gender. But up until that time, it was reserved, not consciously. It wasn't consciously held back. It was unconsciously held back because I didn't get it. Now I get it. That's like 18 years ago. And the reason I'm doing this series of talks is that it took me that much longer to realize this continuity concept that there is this amazing continuity to life, and many people just miss it. They miss it because they're so framed in their history, and they're not turning the page of their biography. They keep reading the same chapter over and over and over again. No wonder it's boring. No wonder you become lackluster. No wonder you become limited or marginalized. Excuse me. So the whole concept here is one of putting ourselves in the position of having to see a truth that's always there, but not always easy to see, not always easy to get to. And in the book that they wrote, The Myth of the Goddess, there's a quote from Carl Jung in the book. It says, "The great events of world history are at bottom profoundly unimportant." Imagine that. The great events of world history are profoundly unimportant. In the last analysis, the essential thing is the life of the individual. This alone makes history. Here alone do the great transformations take place. And the whole future, the whole history of the world ultimately springs as a gigantic summation from these hidden sources. In our most private and most subjective lives, we are not only the passive witness of our age and its sufferers, but also its makers. We make our own epics, our own places in time. Now, a profound thing is on television. It's called Who Do You Think You Are? Where do you think it came from? I can't remember the name of it exactly, but it's about people tracing their ancestors back. And this week they had Reba McEntire. You all know who she is, famous country singer. So she's tracing herself back. And in every one of these situations, they get to a place, they go back a couple, 3, 4, 5, 6 generations, and they suddenly realize, my God, that person was a scoundrel. My God, this person was a saint. My God, this person did nothing. You know, so it's like they have all these different people. And you know, Emerson put it perfectly. He said, "You're all scoundrels and saints at the same time." Why is that the case? Because it took 2 million relationships to get you here. To get you to the place where you could have the realization to look within and see it happening. And there was this one story with Blair Underwood, this wonderful African-American actor. And he's tracing his history back to the early 19th century, about 1820. And his grandfather was his great-great-great-great-grandfather was a free black man in South Carolina. And he owned slaves. Now you think, see, the conclusion you draw is, my God, how could this man own slaves? It's because he was buying back his family. Does that shift it? Yeah, that shifts it. It changes when you realize that the absolute intensely piece of you always wants the best for your family. And if you had to be in a position like he was, wouldn't you buy your family back? Now my suggestion to you is, though, how many of you have ignored your family? How many of you have given up on your family? Because you don't see them as human beings anymore. You see them as circumstances and conditions, or perhaps addicts or whatever. How many of you are supremely unhappy about that? So the only way you get over the unhappiness is to practice gratitude and forgiveness, which is what the end of this talk is all about. Without gratitude, you cannot be happy. I don't care what you've got. I don't care how many goodies you've got. Without being thankful, you can't be happy. And without forgiveness, you'll never be satisfied. You've got to be grateful. And you've got to practice it. Just like Chip Walter says in this book, it's not natural. It doesn't come to us natural. It's like teaching a bear to ride a bicycle. You can teach a bear to ride a bicycle, but is that natural? No, it's not. Is it natural for you to forgive people? Probably not. So you got to practice it. You got to consciously, every day, practice it. Because if you don't, it will eat away at the interior of who you are until there's an emptiness in your heart that will cry out for some resolution. And usually that resolution is a full-blown breakdown. You are all worthwhile. You are all children, expressions of a great, enormous power. Don't overlook